Welcome back. In this session, we are going to look at how to query data from Delta Lake tables. So what I have done is I've taken the same green taxi data related to trip information and turned that into Delta format. So let's go into the folder. And as you can see here, you'll see the year folders here similar to what you saw with the Parquet and CSV. And if you go into the folders, you're going to see the month folders. And if you go into the month folder again, you'll see the Parquet file. So at first you might be thinking, actually, this is exactly the same as. You are right. Delta stores the data in Parquet format. But what differentiates Delta table is the transaction logs within a Delta-like table. Usually you will see another folder called Delta_log and that keeps transaction logs. So these transaction logs helps us achieve as a transactions and query previous versions of the data and time travel and all of that good things that comes with Delta Lakes. So in summary, the data in Delta Lake is usually in Parquet format and they contain another folder called Delta log and that's what makes it a Delta Lake table. So unlike the CSV and Parquet files, the Delta Lake table has to be queried from the main folder, which is the trip data green Delta. In our case, you cannot query the subfolders. For example, year 2020, our year 2020 month 01. And you cannot query the files directly either. I can see the files inside. The folders themselves are in Parquet format and the transaction log in the main folder is what makes it Delta Lake table. So you will have to query the main folder in order for that to be identified as a Delta Lake table. So this is one key information you want to keep in mind. And during the lesson, I'll show you what happens if you query one of the subfolders directly. And also I'll show you how to target partitions without cutting the subfolders directly. Let's create a SQL script to query this data. So I'm going on new SQL script, and then I'm going to name this as 9_explore trip data green Delta. And as we did with the other ones, let's use the database that we created, which is the NYC Taxi Discovery. And then I'm going to do this. Select top 100 records from the open row set. And we specify the format as. So instead of Parquet in the last one, the format here is Delta. And one of the things you may notice is that actually I've specified the bulk file path as just the folder name, so we're not going into the file. So we are not going into these subfolders, and we just need the alias here. So I'm going to call that a trip data, and let's run this through and see what happens. And as you can see here, it's done the automatic schema inference. So you've got all the column names being identified. The way it works is very similar, are exactly the same as Parquet files. As you could say, the Delta tables also use case files and the Parquet files have got the metadata and data and the Serverless SQL Pool query engine gets the metadata from the Parquet file and then comes up with the column names and the data types for those. So the behavior will be exactly the same as Parquet files. One difference you will notice is that if you scroll to the right, you will see two new columns. So when you read the Parquet files, you wouldn't have seen these two columns, but they are the partition columns. If we go back to the data, as you can see, we got the year as one of the partitions and we've got the month, another partition. What the query engine has done is taken those partitions and turned them into columns for us. So you've got the 2020 as the year in this case and the month of 02. So now we'll have the ability to limit our data based on the where clause using these partition columns. So as I said before, you don't have the ability to go and query the subfolders, but instead you can use your where clause to limit your data and target partitions. We'll see all of that in action. But let's start with querying a subfolder and see what kind of errors you would get and why you would get that as well. Let's start with that. Let's change the file path to include year equals to 2020. We know the folder exists, so let's see what happens. I'm going to just run that through now. And as you can see, it says content of the directory on path cannot be listed. This path cannot be listed. So if you look closely, it's gone up to the year 2020 and then it's looking for a Delta log folder and within that it is looking for a JSON file. As you could see previously, the Delta log sits in the main folder. So you've got the Delta log here, not within the year 2020 because there is no Delta log folder within year 2020. It says this is not a Delta table. As we said a couple of times before, Delta log is what makes a Delta table a Delta table. So if there is no Delta log folder within a folder, you won't be able to query that folder. And the next thing I wanted to show you is the data types, as we did previously with the Parquet. Let's call this stored procedure and try and get the data types. So again, I've just called the stored procedure here and filled in the SQL. But as you know, we like to escape all the quotes, so I'm going to just do that and run the SQL. I think I'd say most of the data types looks good, but varchar columns. For example, the store and forward flag is still being set to varchar, which are 8,000. And if you scroll down further, you'll see that year and the month, which are the partitioned columns, are supposed to be lighter, full for this one and 2 for the month. But they've been set to 8,000 as well. So it is definitely a good practice to specify the column names and the data types using the with clause. So let's do that quickly. I have already prepared the column names and the data types just to save a bit of time. As you can see, I've specified this store and for forward flag varchar 1, and similarly I've changed the year and month to be varchar 4 and varchar 2. If we run this one, there will be no differences in the outputs, but it will be now using the right data types. And that's run through successfully. So that's brilliant. And similar to Parquet, you can get much better performance by selecting only the required columns. We've got a number of columns here. And let's assume that we want to limit that trip amount and trip type. In that case, we only want to specify the trip amount and trip type. So similar to what we did for the Parquet. Let's look at the messages and see how much data are being read. And as you can see, the data scan for all columns is 5 megabytes. And if we just remove all the columns and just leave the columns we need, it's going to be much smaller. So let me do that. We've now got only the trip amount on that trip type. You have to remember that when you specify the column names, you have to specify the partitioning column names. So we need to specify the year and month. Otherwise, you are going to get an error. So let me specify the year and month, and then if I just run that through now, I'm going to see the data as I expected. And if you go into messages, you're going to see that actually the data scanned is very little. It's only 1 MB as opposed to the 6 with all the columns that. So please be mindful. I always specify only the columns you want to select, and you don't want to be selecting everything. But you will always have to specify the columns which are used to partition the data. So at the beginning of the lesson we said actually we can't use for the parts to target partitions like we did with the CSV in the Parquet files. How do we achieve that in Delta? I said before we can use that year and the month exposed by the query engine to target the specific partitions. Let's see that in action. I'm going to first do a distinct count of one of the columns for all of the data, and then do it only for a month and the year, and we'll see how much data is being scanned. I'm going to simply copy this select and then make those changes. I am going to remove the with clause just to keep it simple. So I've taken the column payment type and I'm doing a count distinct on the payment type, and we haven't got anywhere clause as we're looking at the main Delta table, and we haven't specified any with clause here. So what's going to happen is it's going to scan all of our data and get the payment type, that distinct payment types from those from that data. So let me run that through. And within this data, we only got the payment type 5. That's fine. But let's have a look at how much data is being scanned. And as you can see here, the total size of the data scanned is 4 megabytes. Now, let's just target a partition. So let's take the same query. But this time, let's apply a where class with a filter on the partition columns. So let's assume that we want to get data from only year 2020 and month 01. And this should in theory target that partition and read only that file and give us the data. And the results came back very quickly. And also, let's have a look at the messages. And as you can see, it scanned only 1 megabytes, and it took about 3 seconds and a bit more. And if I run this one, it'll be slightly more, I hope. And as you can see, tick over 2.5 seconds. But when you're working with massive amounts of data, these things will add up and you'll be seeing massive differences between what you're doing. So I always try to target partitions. If your data is partitioned within Delta, you can do that by using the where clause on partition columns. It's very simple compared to what we did with the CSV and Parquet files. So one last thing before we finish this lesson. As we discussed before, Delta gives us the ability to keep history. So, for example, let's assume that the data we got within our delta-like table is version 1. And you bring in new data or you update any data which is already there. Then this will stay as version 1 and your new data will be version 2. So that is your current version. And if you use something like Databricks or Spark Pool, you will be able to query data from specific versions. If you query version 1, you'll see the data you're currently seeing. Version 2 will give you this data plus the additional data. And if you've deleted any data from the first version, they'll be dropped from the second version. So you'll see a current view or current picture of what you want. By cutting version to R, you will get the previous version's data if you query version 1. But Serverless SQL Pool at the time of recording doesn't support this. You can only query the current data. So if you added any new data to this Delta Lake table, you will see the new data. There is no means of going back and looking at the data from the previous version. So effectively, there is no support in Serverless SQL Pool currently for time travel, but I hope that will be introduced at some point in the future. And when I come to know about it, I will update the course to reflect that.